All right, today we're going to be talking about the moderate period of the French Revolution. So, specifically, we're going to look at sort of, well, what happened, and then how did the government try and realize those Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality during this time period. But, spoilers, this moderate period isn't going to last too long. We're going to start to shift into the radical phase at the end of this lecture today. That's the one with the guillotines, so no guillotines today, but those are coming. All right, so where we last left off, Louis XVI had decided to convene the Estates General, which, as we remember, was a parliamentary body made up of representatives from the three estates in order to deal with France's mounting debt crisis. So, the Estates General is made of about 300 delegates from the First Estate, so that's the clergy if you recall, 300 delegates from the Second Estate, and 600 delegates from the Third Estate there. So the Third Estate, right, they're the largest in terms of population, but they're still, these numbers aren't proportionate, right? So they do have more representatives than the First and the Second Estate, but it doesn't represent their share of the actual population in reality. So it's already not very equal, right? And then immediately after the Estates General is convened, controversy erupts over what or how voting is going to work. So how the different estates are going to vote on proposals. So the Parlement of Paris, which, as you recall, is made up largely of nobles and pretty conservative nobles, calls for what they say, or what's called a vote by order. So what they want is for whenever there's some sort of decision coming before the Estates General, they want each estate to have one vote. So First Estate gets one vote, Second Estate gets one vote, Third Estate gets one vote, right? So very, very unequal. The Third Estate, even though they have the vast majority of the population, and they make up half the delegates at the Estates General, right? They still only have one vote. So the clergy and the nobles can easily outvote the Third Estate, right? Now, some Enlightenment-minded nobles break with that, and then some members of the bourgeoisie, so the middle class, right, who's part of the Third Estate, they say, no, that's really unequal. Let's have a vote by head. So each delegate gets one vote. So the 300 delegates from the First Estate each get one vote per delegate, so 300 votes. 300 delegates from the Second Estate, each one of those delegates gets one vote. Each one of the 600 delegates from the Third Estate gets one vote, right? So it makes it a little bit more equal. So take a second and think which are these two proposals, who benefits from them? So a vote by order, who does that benefit? A vote by head, who does that benefit? All right. So as you can imagine, the Third Estate delegates are already not happy with how the situation is going down. So they start to think about forming their own National Assembly. So just breaking with the Estates General completely, saying, hey, this process isn't fair, we reject it, and then coming up with their own legislative group, and then drafting a new constitution for France and making France into a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what England had. Their anger only intensifies when on one day they attempt to meet with the rest of the Estates General at Versailles, but they find that the door is locked. So they show up one morning, they try and get inside, the door is locked, and they're like, hey, this is ridiculous. This is even more unfair. They want to completely, literally, physically shut the Third Estate out of proceedings. They literally don't want us to be here, right? So undeterred, what they decide to do is they walk over to a nearby indoor tennis court, and take what's called the tennis court oath, which is this really famous vow not to disband until they have drafted a constitution. So they're really developing this identity of themselves, the Third Estate, as a class that is separate from the First and Second Estate and that deserves a whole range of political reform. Now, how does Louis XVI respond to this? Well, he decides, or he threatens to dissolve the Estates General, right? He's like, hey, if you won't cooperate with me, you won't make policy that's in my interest, right? Then goodbye. I'm not even going to listen to you anymore. How can you imagine they react? All right, so we're actually going to put a pause there for just a second, and we're going to start to talk about, so that's sort of what's going on with sort of like these middle-class lawyers and intellectuals, right? So you got some of those Enlightenment-minded nobles, right? But what's really important to know about the French Revolution is it's not just the bourgeoisie. It's not just those people who are sitting around in salons reading Enlightenment philosophy, right? The revolution is a product of sort of the workers in the towns, right? And it's also the product of the peasants. And just to illustrate that, one of the most famous events of the French Revolution is this event called the storming of the Bastille. So what happens is a rumor spreads that Louis XVI is about to order the military to crack down on the National Assembly. Not too far-fetched, right? He is trying to dissolve the Estates General, so not totally crazy. So what happens is that workers in Paris, so the townspeople, right, storm this prison that's called the Bastille. Now, the Bastille isn't just a prison, it's also an armory, so there are allegedly weapons stored there. So what the workers are trying to do is liberate the prisoners and gain access to weapons. Once they storm the Bastille, they tear it down brick by brick, but they find that there's not really a lot of prisoners there, and there's also not really a lot of weapons. So it's not really a big practical success for them. They don't really get any weapons. They don't free a lot of prisoners. But it's a really important symbol or symbolic victory, because the Bastille was a symbol of the oppression of King Louis XVI. And not only is this a big symbolic victory, right, but it inspires workers in other towns. And so the revolution begins to spread outside of Paris and the surrounding regions. All right. But so those are the workers, right? The peasants also participate in the revolution. So the revolution spreads to the countryside. So in the summer of 1789, so July 19th to August 3rd, even more rumors spread that the king was about to bring in both French and foreign troops to suppress the revolution. And these rumors are called the Great Fear. And just as a little side note here, this is just a wonderful illustration that fake news and rumors have been with us for a really, really long time and have inspired political action. So this is not just a result of social media and the internet, for sure. So as a result of the Great Fear, peasants panic and revolt against their noble landlords and raid their manors. So if we remember right, serfdom is pretty much done in France, but French peasants still have to pay feudal dues and fees to their landlords, and the landlords have the right to their property, right? So they can hunt on land that could technically be considered the peasants, right? So the peasants are under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and they revolt as well. So the National Assembly, now that they're essentially in charge and trying to write a new constitution, they respond by eliminating some of those restrictions on the peasants. So they eliminate the landlord's rights, so seigneurial rights, but they don't eliminate all of the feudal dues. Now, this is actually a mistake that they make they're going to make a couple of times. So they go a little bit further, they implement a little bit of reform, but they don't implement enough. So that makes the peasants really upset. Moreover, they implement just enough reform that alienates the nobles, right? Because they're sad about angry about losing their rights and privileges. So the National Assembly is aiming for this middle ground, but what they're doing is they're alienating the radicals and alienating the conservatives. All right. So the National Assembly, now that they're in charge, so remember, they were the group that split off from the Estates General, right? And they've decided to write a constitution. They actually renamed themselves. They call themselves the Constituent Assembly because they're writing a new constitution. So they get they get to work on that right away. But before they finish the Constitution, they also publish a number of other really important documents. So one of them is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So this is analogous to the Declaration of Independence in the United States. They're saying, here's what we're doing. We're rebelling. Here's why. So it's strongly influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and by the American Declaration of Independence. So this is all social contract theory, right? The idea that people have natural rights. If the government doesn't protect those natural rights, that people have the right to overthrow it. So we see that in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen as well. Now, the National Assembly, or the Constituent Assembly, also issues another really important document called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And this is an attempt to reform the church. So it requires that church leadership be elected, and it requires that all clergy swear an oath of allegiance to the new constitution. Now, this plus another action that they take, which is that they confiscate church lands for the states, this really angers a lot of clergy members, especially those high-ranking clergy members, which, as we recall, right, those people were a lot more likely to sympathize with the nobility, with the king, right? So those people are not at all happy about losing their rights and privileges. Now, moreover, while the National Assembly is sitting around trying to write a constitution, famine and unrest continues. And in October of 1789, thousands of angry Parisian women demanding bread march on Versailles, right, which is still where King Louis is living. So what they do is they basically trash Versailles. They force the king and his family to go back to Paris, where they can be more closely watched by the revolutionaries. Right. So by 1791, so let's fast forward a little bit, the National or the Constituent Assembly completes the new constitution. And it is really radical. So what it does is it establishes a limited monarchy, right? So the king is basically he has to listen to this legislative body, right? Just like what we saw in England. The legislative body that they establish is called the Legislative Assembly, and that is elected. And then the new constitution also grants civil rights to all, even though it only grants the vote to tax-paying men. If you remember from United States history, this isn't too unusual. So we gotta wait a while for the vote to be extended to women, to non-tax-paying men, et cetera, so to the poor. Now, this constitution, again, it hits on that problem that the Constituent Assembly or the National Assembly keeps encountering, right? The Constitution, on the one hand, isn't quite radical enough for some, but is way too radical for others, which kind of upsets the extremes on both sides. All right, so this is the stage, 1791, where we start to slide into the radical phase. So the revolution is about to get more radical, and it's about to get way more bloodthirsty. And there's three factors that help lead to this. So the first is the rise of radical political clubs. The second is King Louis XVI's escape attempt. I can talk. And then the third one is threats from abroad, which is really sort of the match that lights the fire. And we'll go through each one of these in depth. All right, so the first factor that leads the revolution to radicalize is the rise of radical political clubs. So during this moderate period, so 1789 to 1791, a variety of political clubs, which are a lot like modern political parties, start to form. So one of these is called the Jacobins, and it's made up mostly of bourgeois, so middle-class professionals, so a lot of lawyers. Now, they start off really moderate, but they become increasingly left-wing from 1791 onwards. So they become increasingly radical onward. You might be wondering, hey, left-wing, what does that mean? So this is actually the point in history where we see the emergence of the left-right political spectrum. And it was based on where people sat in the National Assembly. So if you sat further to the left, that meant you really wanted reform, you really wanted progress, maybe even wanted to do away with the king. You didn't want just a you didn't want just a limited monarchy, you wanted no monarchy at all. If you sat further to the right, on the other hand, though, that meant that you wanted to conserve parts of the old regime. You didn't want to go too far in the other direction and get rid of systems that they thought were working. What's really interesting about this is this left-right language extends way beyond the French Revolution, and we still use it today. And it's all over public discourse in the United States and in Europe, too. So, for example, today we would use the term right wing in the United States to describe people who are more conservative politically. So Trump, the Republicans, etc., those folks would be considered right wing. And then we also still use the term left wing to talk about people who want change, who want progress. So we would call these people today in the United States progressives or liberals. So like Bernie Sanders, for example, would be considered left wing. So that language comes right out of the French Revolution and is still with us. All right, so factor two that causes the revolution to radicalize actually has to do with Louis XVI. So as you recall, he is stuck in Paris, kind of under virtual house arrest. So in June of 1791, Louis decides that he can kind of see the writing on the wall, and he realizes the situation is not going to be great for him. I'm sure he had read a little bit of history. He's thinking of the English Civil War, and he's like, I don't know if my head's going to stay on too much longer. So what he does is, as you recall, right, he has family out, so Marie Antoinette is from Austria. So he tries to flee, but he only makes it to this border town called Varennes before he is captured. So as you can imagine, this makes a lot of people really angry, right? They're like, oh my God, Louis is trying to escape justice. He's trying to run away from us. But what the National Assembly does, aside from a few dissenting leftists or radicals, actually they just are like, oh, hey, no big deal. Like, we understand you try to run away. Like, let's let bygones be bygones. Sorry about that. And what this does is it really angers the radicals, and it causes them to lose trust in the National Assembly. They're like, hey, you're here. You're supposed to write this great constitution that creates this limited monarchy. And the minute the king does something wrong, you just sort of, brush it under the rug. You're like, hey, whatever, it's fine. That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Now, third factor that causes the revolution to radicalize are threats from abroad. And again, this is the big one. So remember, right, as I said, Marie Antoinette, she's Austrian. She's got family in Austria. Prussia at this point still has a pretty sort of, I wouldn't say an absolute monarchy, right? But we've sort of drifted towards the Enlightenment, but they're still pretty absolute. So King Frederick William II of Prussia and then Emperor Leopold II of Austria issue this document called the Declaration of Pillnitz, which is a promise to protect King Louis. Now, why do they do this? Well, first of all, they're afraid the revolution is going to spread to their countries, right? They're like, hey, this is our neighbor. There's stuff going on here. We don't want that to come over here, right? We don't want a revolution over here. Moreover, there's also a lot of French nobles at this point who have fled France, also seeing the writing on the wall, and they put a lot of pressure on the governments of Prussia and Austria and saying, hey, this is bad news. You guys got to stop these people. Now, what does the legislative do in response, or the Legislative Assembly do in response? They demand that Austria give up its émigrés. What terrible move. So Leopold is like, no, I'm not going to do that. And in response, France declares war on Austria. Now, again, not a great move. So the fighting goes really badly for France, which really angers radicals because they're already not super happy with the Legislative Assembly, right? They're already starting to lose faith. They want more reform. They're not seeing it. And this just to them is another sign that the Legislative Assembly is not doing its job. It's going south. So what do the radicals do? They start to look for scapegoats. And second cliffhanger, we're going to leave it there and then pick up with the radical phase. Get ready for some guillotines.